Today is April 25th, and we're going to be talking about Matthew chapter 14. And I'm going to start with some things that I noticed that were interesting, and then answer 3 questions. What did I learn about Jesus? What did I learn about people? And what is the next step I can take? And then when I'm finished with those things, I will go ahead and read Matthew chapter 14 aloud. So one of the first things I noticed is when Herod talks about Jesus and says that maybe it is John the Baptist that has risen from the dead, because you see in that next section that they go back and talk about how John the Baptist has been beheaded. And honestly, Herod's not the only one who thinks this. I thought that was kind of interesting. Like, multiple people are like, well, maybe Jesus is John the Baptist, even though Jesus is only like, I don't know, a couple of months older than John the Baptist because he's his cousin. So I thought that was interesting that they talk about that a little bit and let us know what happens to him. And then what do I learn about people? Well, in verse 22 and following, it talks about the boat, and when they saw Jesus walking on the water, he thought he was a ghost and they were terrified. And that made me think, I think we're often afraid of things we don't know, of the unexplained. And we freak out and we're shivering and we're terrified because we just don't understand it. And even though in this case it was Jesus. And then again, it talks about how Peter was trying to walk on the water with Jesus, but then he looked at the waters and got distracted and was afraid again. And so I think we often let our emotions rule us. We get distracted and we get afraid and we get terrified, and we don't look at the good. We don't see Jesus in those moments sometimes. And so that's what I learned about people. What I learned about Jesus is, it says in 2 different times in verse 13 that Jesus had withdrawn to a solitary place, and then again that he went up to a mountainside to be by himself in verse 23. Jesus twice took the time to be alone. Jesus needed alone time. He needed a quiet place to think, to contemplate, to pray to God. And so I think that kind of leads me to my next step. We need to take time to be alone with God and with Jesus, and to not be constantly filling our thoughts and filling our head with thoughts and things and all of that stuff. We need to take that time to be quiet, to be alone, be solitary, where there are no distractions, where there are no things that will keep us from focusing on Jesus, and spend that time alone with him, talking to him. And so now I'm going to go ahead and read Matthew chapter 14. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the reports about Jesus, and he said to his attendants, "This is John the Baptist. He is risen from the dead. That is why miraculous powers are at work in him." Now Herod had arrested John and bound him and put him in prison because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. For John had been saying to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." Herod wanted to kill John, but he was afraid of the people because they considered John a prophet. On Herod's birthday, the daughter of Herodias danced for the guests and pleased Herod so much that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptist." The king was distressed, but because of his oaths and his dinner guests, he ordered that her request be granted, and had John beheaded in prison. His head was brought in on a platter and given to the girl, who carried it to her mother. John's disciples came and took his body and buried it. Then they went and told Jesus. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed the sick. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." "We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Bring them here to me," he said, and he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized Jesus, they sent word to all the surrounding country. People brought all their sick to him and begged him to let the sick just touch the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. And until next time, you are sent.